Trump didn't lose this fight in a tweet or a press conference. He's losing it in spreadsheets, port schedules, and trade annexes that most voters will never read. Right now, while the headline "Wars Rage About Tariffs" and "America First," a $45 trillion trade corridor is being wired together that treats the United States not as the center of gravity, but as optional background noise. Almost 40 countries are quietly testing how far they can push a world where exports no longer need a US buyer at the end of the chain. The largest economic realignment since the Cold War is no longer a forecast, it's a process that has already started. At its core is a simple, brutal question. If you can sell to 1.5 billion consumers inside a unified, low-tariff zone stretching from Lisbon to Tokyo, why would you keep letting Washington hold your supply chains hostage? This is the logic behind the new $45 trillion alliance without America. A dense, technical project dressed up in polite diplomatic language, but designed for one purpose: to make US leverage over global trade shrink year after year until it becomes just one preference among many. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a stage in the Swiss Alps. Late January 2026, Davos. Snow, security cordons, the usual choreography of private jets and public speeches. But just days before world leaders landed, Donald Trump had done something that cut through the noise. He threatened sweeping new tariffs on several key European allies unless Denmark agreed to hand over Greenland. This wasn't a meme or a one-off late-night rant. It was a clear demonstration that, in his mind, tariffs are not a last resort tool. They are a weapon you can point at friends as easily as you point it at rivals. In diplomatic cables and WhatsApp chats between ministers, that moment landed like an earthquake. If the US president is willing to use the world's largest consumer market as a blunt instrument over an island, what will he do over semiconductors, energy, data? And more importantly, why would any rational middle power, Canada, Japan, Germany, Singapore, keep their economic lifelines routed through a capital that treats access to its market as a personal pressure valve? So, when Canada's Prime Minister took the main stage in Davos, most of the audience heard a familiar tone: multilateralism, cooperation, connecting regions, all the comfort words of the global elite. What they didn't catch, or didn't want to catch, was that he was quietly announcing the beginning of an economic architecture that cuts around the United States rather than through it. He laid out a vision: link the European Union with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 12-nation trade pact that already binds together Canada, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Chile, Peru, Brunei, and the United Kingdom. Add the EU's 27 member states, and you no longer have scattered bilateral deals. You have a single corridor, nearly 40 countries, around 1.5 billion consumers, and about 40% of global GDP that can trade, invest, and build supply chains without touching US territory or asking for US permission. On paper, it sounded like another Davos flourish. In reality, it was a status update. Canadian officials were already shuttling between Brussels, Tokyo, Singapore, and Canberra, sounding out how far everyone was prepared to go. A senior official told one outlet the talks were coming along and the discussions very fruitful. The kind of bland phrasing diplomats use when something real is moving, but nobody wants to trigger headlines too early. Here's the part almost no one outside trade circles noticed. The real weapon in this alliance is not a flashy new treaty name or a giant press release. It's a technical switch buried deep in annexes, rules of origin cumulation. Right now, every trade agreement on the planet runs on rules of origin. They decide whether a product counts as local enough to qualify for low or zero tariffs. If too much of the value is built outside the agreement, your car, battery, or microchip gets treated like a stranger and hit with full duties. That sounds dry, but it's the difference between a supply chain that hums and one that stalls. Imagine a Japanese battery, a Vietnamese sensor, and a Canadian final assembly with the finished product shipped to Germany. Under today's patchwork of separate deals, each leg of that chain has to tiptoe through different sets of rules. At some point, the combination stops qualifying as local enough, and the tariffs snap back. The more global the supply chain, the more vulnerable it becomes to those invisible tripwires. Cumulation changes that. It says, if your parts are made anywhere inside this combined UCPTPP zone, we treat them as local everywhere inside it. A battery stamped in Japan, semiconductors etched in Singapore, software coded in Ireland, assembly in Mexico. As long as it all happens inside the block, it counts. The tariffs fall to zero or near zero across the entire corridor. Now put the United States back into this picture. With cumulation, you can design your supply chain so that no critical component needs to cross US borders at all. A German automaker can source batteries from Japan, chips from Singapore, wiring harnesses from Vietnam, assemble in Mexico, and sell into both Europe and Asia, without touching a single American port or paying a single American tariff. The system doesn't need the United States to work. It works better without it. That is the quiet revolution. The new $45 trillion alliance isn't anti-US on paper. It never uses that language. But in practice, it designs a world where US participation becomes optional, and US attempts at punishment become less and less painful for everyone else. Business groups in Germany have already described the ability to combine rules of origin across multiple deals as very useful and potentially transformative for exporters that rely on complex supply chains. Japanese officials talk about a lot of value in deeper integration with Europe for exactly one reason: resilience. They want to know that if Washington wakes up one morning and decides to weaponize tariffs again, their factories don't immediately go dark. Brussels insiders, according to reports, are described as super keen to push this forward because it's rare to find a project that simultaneously pleases industry, strengthens geopolitical leverage, and doesn't require asking Congress for permission. Here's where the panic begins to seep into Washington. Trump's team sold tariffs as a way to make the United States wealthy and to force others to play by American terms. But multiple studies and even administration-friendly analysts have admitted that almost all of the cost, roughly 90%, lands not on foreign governments, but on US households through higher prices. It shows up in grocery bills, in appliance prices, in the margins of small manufacturers who suddenly pay more for imported inputs but can't raise prices without losing customers. So you have a double effect. Inside America, tariffs function like an invisible consumption tax that no one voted for. Outside America, they function like a wake-up call to every finance ministry and trade office on the planet. The message: if you stay dependent on the US market, you are one press conference away from a crisis you didn't cause. That's why this new alliance matters. It takes that fear and turns it into architecture. It moves from complaining about tariffs in press conferences to hard-coding alternatives into trade law. It says, to middle powers, you no longer have to choose between being in Washington's good graces and having access to global demand. There is now a third option, a corridor where you can grow without asking the White House for a waiver. Let me throw a question at you here. If you were running a mid-sized export economy, say a country like the Netherlands, South Korea, or Malaysia, would you build your future on a market where the rules change on a presidential mood, or on a zone where the rules are boring, predictable, and written years in advance? I want you to pause and answer that for yourself in the comments. If you were sitting in their finance ministry, which system would you bet your next decade on? The tariff roulette wheel or the 40-nation corridor? Because this is bigger than one leader or one administration. Historically, once a dominant power starts using access to its market as a punishment tool, the rest of the world eventually starts building escape routes. The British learned this the hard way when imperial preferences pushed others to integrate without London. The same pattern is now playing out with Washington. Only this time, the escape route isn't a rival empire. It's a mesh of medium powers quietly deciding they're done being the collateral damage of US domestic politics. Inside the United States, the story is told differently. Tariffs are framed as strength, as leverage, as a way to force everyone back to the negotiating table. But look at what's actually happening in Brussels, Ottawa, Tokyo, and Singapore. While Washington is busy drafting new tariff lists, their teams are drafting annexes on cumulation, harmonizing standards, linking dispute mechanisms, and exploring how quickly they can operationalize an integrated production base. One camp is raising the price of entry, the other is building a new door. And this is where Trump's strategy starts to look less like America first and more like America alone. By turning every trade relationship into a transactional standoff, he weakens the one thing that actually made US leadership durable: predictability. For decades, allies could disagree with Washington on individual issues, but still trust that the basic trade framework wouldn't be rewritten every election cycle. That trust is now eroding, and once it goes, it doesn't come back easily. There's also a deeper psychological shift underway. When officials in Europe or Asia talk off the record today, they don't just complain about tariffs. They talk about de-risking their relationship with America the way they used to talk about de-risking their relationship with China. Think about that for a second. The United States is slowly being reclassified in their heads, not as the anchor of stability, but as another source of volatility that needs to be hedged. The EU-CPTPP corridor is one of those hedges. It's not a military alliance. It's not a currency bloc. It's something subtler, a way of telling businesses, you can grow here under one set of rules with enough scale that you don't have to panic every time Washington threatens a new tariff list. When German chambers of commerce say harmonizing rules of origin would be a major advantage, they're not making a theoretical point. They're saying this would let our companies redesign their entire logistics map away from the US bottleneck. Let me ask you something directly. Do you think this kind of alliance is justified? That it's a necessary response to US tariff aggression? Or do you see it as a dangerous fragmentation of the global system that will eventually hurt everyone? I want you to pick a side and explain it below. Is this $45 trillion corridor a smart self-defense move by US allies, or a slow-motion breakup of the very order that made them rich? The irony is that in pure numbers, the United States is still enormous. Its consumer market remains one of the most profitable on Earth. Its financial system still sets the tone for global liquidity, and the dollar still dominates reserves and trade invoicing. But in a world where a 40-country zone can offer comparable scale, lower tariffs, and less drama, raw size is no longer enough. If you're a multinational deciding where to build your next factory, you don't just ask where the customers are. You ask where the rules are stable. This is why that phrase, from essential to optional, matters. For decades, being plugged into the US market was not a choice. It was a prerequisite. If you were cut off, you were finished. The new alliance flips that logic around. It says you can now build a life without the United States. It might not be as comfortable at first. It might require restructuring, but it is possible. And once something becomes possible in economics, people start planning for it, even if they never admit it publicly. You can already see that planning in unexpected places. Infrastructure projects are being routed through ports that connect more easily to Asia and Europe than to US hubs. Investment promotion agencies pitch their countries as bridges between the EU and Indo-Pacific, not as gateways to America. Trade negotiators talk about alignment with EU standards as a way to unlock the corridor, not as a stepping stone to a US deal. Meanwhile, inside Washington, the debate is still framed in 1990s terms. Who is cheating on trade? Who is taking advantage of US openness? Almost no one in the mainstream conversation is asking the more uncomfortable question. What if the rest of the world just decides not to play this game anymore? What if they build a table somewhere else? You can already see the outlines of that other table in reports from European think tanks and security conferences. They talk about strategic autonomy, about de-risking from great power volatility, about the need to uncouple essential supply chains from any single political center. The EU CPTPP alignment is one of the answers that keeps coming up not as a slogan, but as a spreadsheet full of tariff lines and origin codes. And this brings us back to the number in the title. $45 trillion. That's roughly the combined economic weight of this emerging bloc. Nearly 40 countries drawn from Europe, Asia, and the Americas, locked together not by ideology, but by mutual exhaustion with trade threats. It's large enough that if they decide on a standard for electric vehicle batteries, data flows, or green steel, companies can follow it and still have plenty of customers. American standards stop being the default. They become just one option on a crowded menu. So what happens next? The answer won't come in one dramatic moment. It will come in 1,000 quiet decisions. A plant built in Mexico instead of Texas, a procurement contract that favors EU-aligned standards over US ones, a supply chain rerouted through Singapore instead of Los Angeles. Individually, they look minor. Together, they redraw the map. Before we wrap, I want to know something, not as a statistic, but as a reality check. Where are you watching this from right now? The US, Europe, Asia, somewhere else? Drop your country in the comments. Because whether this $45 trillion alliance feels like an abstract headline or a direct threat depends a lot on where you're sitting. If you're in America, this might feel like betrayal, allies building Plan B behind your back. If you're in Europe or the Indo-Pacific, it might feel like insurance, a necessary firewall against another round of tariff chaos. And if you're in an emerging market that's not yet part of this corridor, it might feel like an invitation you can't afford to miss. What's clear is this: the rest of the world has stopped treating US access as sacred. They're pricing it, hedging it, and in some cases, quietly routing around it. Trump may frame that as proof his pressure works, but from the outside, It looks less like a negotiating tactic and more like the moment America taught its friends how to live without it.